In the modest part of the capital city of Bantu, there was a young man named David who had captured the attention and admiration of everyone who knew him. From the time he could walk, David had displayed a certain character that set him apart from other boys his age. While his peers ran through the streets, laughing and shouting with the vigor of childhood, David could often be found alone, deep in thoughts, and with his eyes fixed on something distant. His mother, who was a devoted Christian, was the first to notice, "This boy is different. It seems like God has a calling on his life," she would often whisper to her husband as they watched David from the doorway, crouched in prayer even as a child. By the age of 18, David had grown into a man of prayer and discipline, spending long hours in the scriptures, asking questions that many around him struggled to answer. He was humble yet firm, and his faith was as solid as the ground beneath his feet. It was his spiritual hunger that led him to Pastor Ezekiel, a seasoned man of God who had built his ministry on the word and the relentless pursuit of truth. David's first encounter with Pastor Ezekiel was on a rainy Sunday afternoon. He had sat in the back of Pastor Ezekiel's small church, and the drumming of the rain on the roof almost drowned out the pastor's powerful sermon. But Daniel heard every word, each one landing in his heart with the weight of a divine command. After the service, David approached the elderly pastor with the excitement of a soul thirsting for more. "Pastor Ezekiel, I want to serve God with my whole life. Will you teach me?" Pastor Ezekiel looked at him thoughtfully for a while. Finally, he nodded. "Serving God is not a decision to be taken lightly, son. But if you are willing to walk the path, I will guide you." And that was how David began discipleship under Pastor Ezekiel. Over the next few years, he poured himself into the work, learning, praying, fasting, and growing under his mentor's watchful eye. Pastor Ezekiel taught him not just the scriptures, but the discipline of patience, the value of humility, and the necessity of love in all things. David, Pastor Ezekiel would often say, a true servant of God must be prepared to give up everything, not just his life, but his pride, his comforts, and even his dreams, if that is what God requires. David listened, absorbing every word. He witnessed miracles, felt the presence of God in ways he couldn't describe, and his own faith grew stronger, like a young tree digging its roots deep into the soil. Years passed, and soon Pastor Ezekiel saw that David was ready. "The time has come," Pastor Ezekiel announced one evening after they had spent hours in prayer. "God has called you to shepherd his people. You are ready." David's heart was filled with both excitement and fear. "But Pastor, how will I know I am truly ready? What if I fail?" Pastor Ezekiel placed a hand on David's shoulder. "If you trust God and keep yourself pure, he will never fail you. Remember, David, the true strength of a pastor lies not in his gifts, but in his obedience." With Pastor Ezekiel's blessing, David stepped into his own ministry. He started his church in a rented one-room building with old walls and mismatched chairs. The first service had only a handful of people, mostly elderly women and curious children. But David was not discouraged. He preached with the same passion he had witnessed in Pastor Ezekiel, and you could feel his conviction and love for God in his voice. In those early days, David faced challenges that would have broken many. His shoes were worn, his clothes were faded, and often he had to fast not because of a spiritual reason, but because he simply had no food. Yet, he remained steadfast, and his prayers were of gratitude to God, even in times of lack, and God saw his heart. Slowly, The church grew as word spread of the young pastor who preached with fire and whose prayers seemed to touch heaven itself. People came from neighboring villages, drawn by stories of healing and of a God who was present and alive in the church. Miracles happened, not because of David, but because of the God he served. Years passed, and soon David's small congregation grew to hundreds. They rented a larger space and then another, until finally they had a building of their own, a massive, beautiful church that was always filled to capacity. David continued to serve with humility, never forgetting the lessons Pastor Ezekiel had taught him. Then one evening, after a particularly powerful crusade where several people had been healed and lives transformed, David gathered with his elders for a short meeting. The elders of the church looked at him meaningfully, as though they had been discussing something important. Pastor David, one of the elders, spoke. The time has come for you to think about finding a partner. You have built this church by God's grace, but you are still a man. Having a woman of God by your side would be a blessing to you and to this ministry. David nodded respectfully. I understand, and I am grateful for your concern, but I want God's will in this matter. I do not wish to make a hasty decision. Of course, another elder chipped in, but pray earnestly, Pastor. We do not want to see you fall to temptation. A man in your position needs the support of a strong and godly woman by his side. David took their counsel to heart, dedicating himself to prayer and seeking God's guidance. He prayed with the fervor he had always known, asking God to send him a life partner if it was his will. And then he waited, trusting that God's timing was perfect. It was during this time that Sister Mary appeared. She was a newcomer, a young woman with a quiet spirit and a faith that seemed to glow from within. She joined almost every department in the church, and her presence was felt everywhere. From the choir to the children's ministry, she was dedicated, sincere, and always eager to help. David couldn't help but notice her. She was different from the others, not just in her devotion, but in her spirit. She had a way of speaking that was gentle and a way of looking at people that made them feel respected and valued. And as the months passed, David found his thoughts drifting to her more often than he would like to admit. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings and counseling, Mary approached him. Pastor, I thought you might be hungry, she said, holding out a dish. I made this for you. David accepted the food, touched by her thoughtfulness. Thank you, Mary. You didn't have to do this. It's my pleasure, Pastor, she replied with a warm and sincere smile. You work so hard for us. It is the least I can do. From that moment, a connection began to form. David found himself drawn to her. He was thinking of Mary more and more. He tried to dismiss these thoughts. He tried to focus solely on his ministry, but she was always there. In the choir stand, leading worship, in the children's ministry, guiding young minds with her gentle voice. She had become an indispensable part of the church community, and her presence was felt in every corner. David prayed, asking God for clarity and for confirmation, and slowly he began to believe that Mary was the answer to his prayers. It did not take long for the elders to notice, and one evening, after service, they approached him to pledge their support. Pastor, Elder Jacob said, it seems like you have found someone who shares your heart for the ministry. David chuckled, slightly embarrassed. Elder, I am simply grateful to have found such a dedicated member in our church. Mary is truly a blessing to us. The elders exchanged glances. Perhaps, said another elder, But you should consider if she is more than just a blessing to the church. A pastor needs a partner, and she seems to possess the qualities of a godly wife." David hesitated. He respected his elder's wisdom, yet he wanted to be sure. "I appreciate your guidance truly. I will continue to seek God's direction. I don't want to rush into anything without his confirmation." The elders nodded, satisfied with his response. But as he lay in bed that night, David's thoughts were consumed by Mary. He prayed more, seeking clarity and asking God to reveal if she was indeed the one meant for him. One night, after a powerful service, Mary stayed back as the congregation left, waiting for David. She approached him. "Pastor David, tonight's message was very powerful. I felt God's presence so strongly." David smiled, feeling a surge of gratitude. "Thank you, Mary. It is only by his grace." She paused for a moment. "You know, Pastor, it has been an honor serving in this church. I feel like I have found a family here." "That is exactly what we are, a family," Pastor replied. "And we are blessed to have you as a part of it." As their eyes met, an unspoken connection passed between them. David felt in his heart a sensation he had not allowed himself to feel to avoid distractions from his ministry. But he quickly refocused, reminding himself of his commitment to purity. But as the weeks passed, his attraction to Mary grew stronger. He couldn't deny the chemistry between them, the ease with which they spoke, and the shared moments of laughter, and the way she seemed to understand his calling as deeply as he did. Finally, after much prayer and contemplation, David gathered his elders and told them his decision. "I believe that God has led me to Mary. She is a woman of faith, and I feel at peace with the thought of her by my side." The elders were overjoyed. "This is wonderful news, Pastor. We have seen her devotion, her heart for service, and we believe she will be a true asset to you and the church." After David's announcement to the church elders that he intended to marry Mary, Mary's behavior began to change slowly. One evening, after a long day of services, David returned home to find Mary waiting on his doorstep with a warm meal in her hands and a charming smile on her face. She stepped inside before he could even invite her. "I thought you might be hungry, Pastor," she said with a soft and inviting voice. "A man who serves as tirelessly as you do deserves to be cared for." David accepted the meal, but there was something in her gaze, a lingering, intense look that made him feel uneasy. "Thank you, Mary," he replied, taking a step back in order to create some distance between them. "But you didn't have to do this." She looked at him warmly. "It's my pleasure, Pastor. I only want to serve you in every way I can." David focused on his meal, trying to brush off the sense of discomfort, but Mary's words echoed in his mind even after she had left. Over the following weeks, Mary's visits became more frequent. She brought meals, offered to help him with his sermons, and even cleaned his home without being asked. On the surface, it seemed innocent, like a devoted fiancé caring for the man she loved. But David felt like something was burning in his spirit, something that didn't feel right. One evening, David returned home only to find Mary waiting inside his home, lighting candles on his dining table. He was startled. "Mary, I didn't expect to see you here." She turned to him with a seductive smile playing on her lips. "I wanted to surprise you. I know how hard you work, and I thought you deserved a warm, comforting evening." He swallowed hard, feeling uneasy. Mary looked beautiful in the dim candlelight, and her features were softened by the glow. David quickly shook his head, reminding himself of the boundaries they had agreed upon. Mary, you know we shouldn't be alone like this. It is not right, he finally said. But Mary stepped closer, reaching out to touch his arm. David, don't you trust me? We are already engaged before God. In his eyes, we are as good as married. But David took a step back. Yes, but you know we agreed to wait until the wedding. It is important to honor that. She sighed sadly. David, I thought you trusted me. Why should we deny our love for each other? It is only natural to want to be close. However, despite his discomfort, David felt himself weakening. He was only human after all, and the warmth of her presence, the softness of her touch was all overwhelming. But he managed to pull himself back, clinging to the conviction he had built his life upon. Mary, he said gently, I want this as much as you do, but we must honor God's commandments. Waiting is difficult, but it is necessary. Mary looked at him for a long moment, and then, without another word, she gathered her things and left. But Mary didn't get disappointed. Rather, her attempts grew bolder, as if she was on a mission. She would arrive late in the evening to David's house, giving excuses to sleep over, and she would even sit close to him, resting on his shoulders and talking in a convincing tone. One evening, after trying to make him fall to no avail, she vented out, David, don't you see me? We are already one in spirit. God has brought us together for a reason. Why should we deny each other? Isn't it just a formality now? David felt his heart pounding and a battle raging within him, but he forced himself to look away, muttering scriptures under his breath and reminding himself of his commitment to purity. No, Mary, we must wait. We are not married yet. God commands purity. Each time he resisted her, her frustration grew, but David remained firm, praying for strength and asking God to help him hold on to his principles. Then, on the night before the wedding, Mary arrived once again, this time unannounced, and her demeanor was different from anything David had ever seen. She wore a dress that hugged her form, her hair was loose, and her makeup was soft but alluring. She looked very seductive, and there was something dark, something different in her eyes. David, she whispered into his ears, drawing a line on his chest with her fingers. Tomorrow we'll be married. Tonight we should be together. David took a step back. Mary, please, we must honor our commitment to God. We agreed to wait. We are almost there. She smiled, a sly, almost triumphant expression that sent a chill down his spine. David, don't you trust me? We already won before God. We are united in spirit. Tomorrow is just for formality. David felt his defense crumbling, and the strength he had always prided himself on slipped through his fingers. Her presence was overwhelming, like a siren's call, drawing him into an ocean he couldn't resist. David, tonight, let me show you my love. Don't deny yourself. Don't deny me. And in that moment, David fell. He gave in to the desire he had fought so hard to resist, the temptation that had been at him for weeks. They spent the night together, and then the next morning, David woke up to an empty bed. He sat up confused for a moment, calling out her name, but there was no answer. He assumed she had left early to prepare for the wedding, and so he quickly prepared himself to meet her in the church. He soon arrived at the church, but His heart skipped a beat as he noticed that she was nowhere in the church. The whole congregation was gathered and the pews filled with smiling faces, but there was no sign of Mary. He tried calling her, but her phone went unanswered and soon it was switched off. Minutes turned into hours, and the congregation began to murmur. Their faces shifted from joy to disappointment, and then to confusion. One by one, they began to leave, looking pitifully at their pastor and judging him with their eyes. By the time the last person had left, David was alone with a shattered heart and confused mind. He fell to his knees as tears streamed down his face. He cried out to God, "Why? Why did this happen? I thought she was the one. I thought this was your will." Following the failed wedding, David found himself consumed by shame and regret. His congregation dwindled and his once thriving ministry reduced to a handful of loyal followers. The miracle ceased too, and the presence of God that had once filled his services now felt distant, as though a veil had been placed between him and the divine. The elders, out of concern for their pastor, approached him one evening. "Pastor David, something has changed. We can all feel it. The members too are leaving. The church is getting empty. Is there something you haven't told us?" David shook his head pitifully. "It is just the wedding, the disappointment. I think that the congregation lost faith after Mary left." The elders nodded and seemed to believe him, but soon even they too left the church. Only one elder, Brother David, remained steadfast by David's side, refusing to abandon him. One evening, he approached David. "Pastor, I believe we need to seek God's face in fasting and prayer. This is more than just a broken engagement. Maybe something spiritual is at work here." David, who was desperate and broken at this point, agreed, and together he and Brother Samuel fasted and prayed for 31 days, seeking answers, asking God to reveal the cause of their troubles. On the final day, as they knelt in prayer, Brother Samuel received a vision that shook him to the core. He turned to David sorrowfully. "God has shown me something. You entered an evil covenant with Mary. She was sent from the pit of darkness to bring doom upon you. What did you do with her?" David's eyes widened as the weight of his sin came crashing down upon him. I didn't know. I thought she was sent by God. It was just once, that night, but I tried to resist her. I really tried. Brother Samuel looked at him pitifully. "Pastor David, even the enemy can appear as an angel of light. You allowed yourself to be deceived, but there is still hope. Confess your sins, repent, and seek God's forgiveness." With a trembling heart, David fell to his knees, crying out to God for mercy. "Father, forgive me. I was blinded by my desires. Cleanse me, restore me. I am nothing without you." And in that moment, David felt a shift, a release from the darkness that had clouded his spirit. But as he rose, he knew that his ministry would never be the same. The church he had built with such passion and dedication was gone, and his congregation had scattered. Out of humility and repentance, David sought refuge in another church, returning to the role of a servant, willing to start from nothing if it meant regaining God's favor. He found peace in the knowledge that he was once again walking in God's light as he served under another pastor's guidance. For the rest of his life, David carried the scars of his choices that reminded him of the cost of temptation and the mercy of God's forgiveness. He would often tell his story to those he mentored. warning them of the dangers of straying from the path and to be aware of the hidden traps laid by the enemy. He was committed to helping others avoid the same mistakes he had made. Thank you for watching this story. Kindly share your thoughts about the story in the comment section and give the story a thumbs up. Also share the story out with your loved ones. Subscribe to this channel if you've not done so. Thank you and remain blessed.